Very good afternoon, students. On this auspicious day of Buddha Purnima, that is 7th May 2020, I welcome you all in my online class for the M.Ed semester 2. Today, we would discuss some key differences in the steps of the research process in quantitative and qualitative studies, that is, the two fundamental research paradigms of educational research. To understand the important differences found in quantitative and qualitative research reports, it is necessary to first learn how researchers go about conducting their studies when they use these two approaches. We know from our previous class that there are basically 8 steps in conducting any kind of educational research as a scientific study. The step 1 is identifying a research problem. Researchers identify a research problem to limit the subject matter of their study and to argue for the importance of the topic and need for the study. We find information about a study's research problem in the introduction section of a research report, normally. Now, in quantitative research, the research problem tends to call for an explanation of the relationships that exist among variables and also a measurement of trends in a population. But in qualitative research, the research problem tends to call for an exploration. That is important. Exploration, because little is known about the problem, and also a detailed description and understanding of a particular phenomenon. Therefore, in quantitative research, researchers identify research problems that call for an explanation of the relationships among variables. Quantitative researchers also identify research problems that call for the researcher to explain the trends in a population. Now, qualitative research is best suited for research problems that call for the need to explore and learn from participants, because important variables are unknown or insufficient for describing a phenomenon chosen for qualitative studies. Now, we all know the second step is literature review. Researchers, why make literature reviews? Because to ensure that their studies build on what is already known about a topic and will add to this understanding. That means through reviewing a literature, a researcher after conducting his or her study can contribute to the knowledge pool already existing in that particular topic. You find information about a study's literature review as part of the introduction section or in its own standalone introductory section of a research report. Now, in quantitative research, we typically find that the researchers include a substantial literature review that they examined early in the research process. This plays an important role in quantitative studies in two ways. Number one, researchers use it to justify the importance for the research problem and to suggest the specific direction for the purpose and research questions for the study. Justifying the research problem means that researchers use the literature to document the importance of the issue examined and the need for a study about it. The literature also directs the purpose statement, research questions, and hypotheses. Researchers identify key variables and the relationships expected among them from the literature and use these variables and expected relationships to provide direction for their studies in quantitative research domain. But in qualitative research, the literature review included in the beginning of the study varies from substantial to minimal. That means in qualitative researches, there may be substantial amount of literature review, or there may be minimal amount of literature review at the beginning of the study. Researchers using qualitative research usually review the literature to justify the need to study the research problem. In addition, their approach may be informed by what they have learned, but they do not use the literature to direct the research questions. This is because qualitative research relies more on the views of participants in the study and less on the direction identified in the literature. Thus, for a researcher to use the literature to prescribe a specific direction for the study is inconsistent with the qualitative approach of learning from participants. Although researchers often do not include extensive literature at the start of their qualitative study, that I have told just a few minutes back, they often return to the literature during the study as new ideas emerge from the data collection and analysis. Thus, the use of literature in qualitative studies is often more dynamic. We should underline this word, dynamic, than in quantitative studies. So in quantitative studies, literature reviews are more or less static in nature. But in qualitative researches, we find dynamic nature of literature review. Now the third step is where researchers specify the purpose of their research. Researchers specify a purpose for their research by identifying the major intent and focus of a study and narrow the intent into specific questions or hypotheses in case of quantitative research. We can normally find a study's purpose statements, research questions and hypotheses also at the end of the introduction section of a research report. In quantitative research, researchers specify those specific narrow purpose to learn about several variables that can be measured or observed. We have discussed this thing in our earlier class. The major statements that provide the direction for a quantitative study, that is the purpose statement, research questions and hypotheses, all specific and narrow, because quantitative researchers identify a set of predetermined variables as the focus for the study. In addition to identifying the variables when specifying a study's purpose, researchers also indicate their overall intent, such as to describe trends for or measure relationships among those variables in a quantitative study. But in qualitative research, researchers specify a purpose that is much more open-ended than in a quantitative study. Qualitative researchers state general, broad questions so that they can explore a topic and learn from participants' perspectives and experiences. The focus of a qualitative study is usually a single phenomenon of interest, as opposed to several variables in a quantitative research. Researchers state this phenomenon and their intent to explore it in a purpose statement while conducting a qualitative research. Now, we all know that to conduct any educational research, we need to choose a research design. So, On the fourth step of conducting any kind of research, either a qualitative research or a quantitative research, researchers have to choose a research design. Therefore, once researchers have stated their study's purpose, they select an overall approach and research design that is suitable to address their purpose. This research design provides a blueprint or plan for how researchers should collect, analyze, and report their data in a study. We normally find this research design description about the research design in the methods section of a research report or article. So in case of quantitative research, researchers choose to use a quantitative approach for their research study. When their problem calls for explanation, the literature provides a specific direction and the purpose requires measurable data for several variables. Therefore, in quantitative research, researchers select a specific quantitative research design for their research studies based on the intent of that study. Two major types of quantitative research designs are experimental designs and non-experimental designs. You will learn about those, perhaps you have already learned about those two fundamental types of research designs in other class of this course 2.2.3. I am not going into detail of those research designs. So researchers either choose a type of experimental design when they want to explain the impact of an intervention and test whether it causes an outcome, or they can choose a type of non-experimental design when they want to describe something about variables without applying an intervention. For example, researchers can plan a coordinational design to explain how variables are related to each other, or a survey design to describe the trends in selected variables. But in qualitative research, researchers generally select an overall approach and research design to plan how they will conduct their study. In many studies, that means in many type of qualitative studies, researchers use what we call a general qualitative approach to gather data from participants and analyze those data for themes. In other qualitative studies, the researchers choose a more formal qualitative designs such as a narrative, ethnographic, case study, or grounded theory design. An example of a qualitative research design is an ethnographic design, which a researcher chooses to understand the shared culture of a group. But qualitative researchers could also choose a grounded theory design, underline grounded theory design, if they want to explore individuals' experiences to develop a theory. Now, in the very first batch of M.Ed under WBUTTPA, a student has conducted a case study under my supervision and guidance. I would like to share the experience of that study, that particular qualitative study with you. But right now, let's go to the fifth step of an educational research. Here, researchers select participants and collect data. Now, researchers select the participants and gather data in order to address their study's purpose and research questions. Although the selected approach and research design provide an overall plan for the study, the researchers still have to implement specific procedures, including identifying participants, obtaining their permission to study them, and collecting information from them that will be useful for answering the research questions. These procedures are reported again in the method section of an article or a research report. Now, in quantitative research, the intent is often to answer questions about what is typical for a large group or across time. Therefore, researchers often select a large number of individuals or organizations to participate in their study, so the results will be more likely to represent the larger group, that means the population. The more individuals studied, the stronger is the case for applying the results to a large number of people. This is called generalization of the results. These quantitative studies, therefore, often include dozens, hundreds, or even thousands of participants, depending on the study's purpose. Researchers normally use instruments to measure the variables of interest from all of these participants. Now we know that an instrument is a tool for recording data in the form of quantitative numbers or scores. It contains specific questions and response possibilities that the researcher establishes in advance of the study. So, all participants use the same response options in the questionnaires. Like we already know about the Likert scale, 5-point Likert scale, 7-point Likert scale, and so on. Examples of instruments are survey questionnaires, checklists that can be used to observe an individual's behaviors, as an example, and standardized tests. We all know about these things. In quantitative research, researchers administer instruments such as these to participants in order to collect data in the form of numbers for each variable of interest. We already know the importance of number in quantitative researches from our earlier class. Now, in qualitative research, researchers focus on gathering data from a few participants to develop an in-depth exploration of the study's topic. The participants in a qualitative study are usually selected intentionally because they should be the individuals who can best help the researcher learn about the phenomenon of interest in his or her selected study topic. Therefore, in qualitative research, researchers generally focus on a small number of participants in order to thoroughly learn about their experiences and perspectives. Qualitative researchers do not begin data collection with a pre-established instrument to measure scores for distinct variables, as it is normally done in quantitative research. Instead, qualitative researchers gather text or image data. They develop forms called protocols for recording data as the study unfolds. These forms pose a few open-ended questions so that the participants can provide their own answers to the questions. Often, questions on these forms will change and emerge during data collection as the researchers learn from participants. Examples of these forms include an interview protocol, which normally consists of 4 to 5 questions, an observational protocol in which the researcher records notes describing the behavior of the participants. Now, the qualitative data gathered from these protocols might include a typed transcription of the audio recording from interviews or notes that a researcher recorded while observing participants in their work setting. Particularly these things we have tried in our case, in our study long back in the first batch of M.Ed. of WBOTTPA. I will definitely share the experience with you in the due course of time. Now, let us discuss about the sixth step of a research. In the sixth step of an educational research, researchers analyze data and report their results. These results summarize what the researchers found and provide answers to the study's research questions. Although the data analysis procedures may be discussed in the method section of a research report, we can also find the study's results described in the separate results section of that report. Now, in quantitative research, researchers analyze the data using mathematical procedures, including calculating statistics and plotting graphs, graphically representing those results. These analyses consist of breaking down the data into parts to answer the research questions. All quantitative studies describe trends in the data, such as the average response to an item across all participants, or a graph of how the scores for a variable changes over time, etc. In addition, most quantitative studies also include statistical procedures such as comparing scores between groups or relating scores for individuals. These procedures produce statistical results that provide information that addresses the study's research questions and hypotheses. Researchers often report their statistical results in the form of tables and figures that summarize the results of many statistical calculations. Here only we conduct the testing of research hypotheses and so on. Perhaps you have already studied this part. Okay. Now, in qualitative research, researchers use a different approach for data analysis because the data in qualitative studies consist of words and pictures, not numbers. Rather than using statistics, formal statistics, the researchers analyze the gathered words and pictures to describe the central phenomenon under study. When analyzing a qualitative database, the researchers divide the text into segments or groups of sentences and interpret the meaning of each segment. From the many segments, they describe the phenomenon and identify patterns in the data that highlight different perspectives about the phenomenon. The findings may be a detailed description of individual people or places. It may also include themes or broad categories that represent the major ideas that the researchers found in the data. In qualitative studies, in which researchers both describe individuals and identify themes, a rich, complex picture emerges of the phenomenon being explored. Now, in the seventh step, researchers normally draw conclusions. Hence, after reporting the results of the data analysis, researchers draw conclusions about the results and the overall study. These conclusions and implications are normally discussed within the conclusion section of a research report. In quantitative research, researchers interpret the results of the statistical analysis in light of initial predictions and prior studies on the topic. This interpretation offers the researchers explanation as to why the results turned out the way they did, and researchers discuss how the results either support or reject the expected predictions. That means finally whether the findings supported the research hypothesis or rejected those hypotheses. Here, researchers also consider how well the study's research process worked and discuss any limitations that occurred in their data collection and analysis procedures. Delimitations of any research studies are also included in this part. Examples of common limitations discussed in the conclusions of quantitative studies include that the researchers have not selected a large enough sample, instruments have not produced the most accurate scores for measuring a variable of interest, like that. But after developing a complex picture of the phenomenon under study through a text analysis, qualitative researchers make an interpretation of the meaning of the findings in their conclusion sections. They may reflect on how the findings relate to existing research or draw out larger, more abstract meaning from the findings. Here, researchers may also state a personal reflection about the significance of the lessons learned during the study or discuss how their experiences and cultural backgrounds affected the interpretations and conclusions drawn. This is an example of qualitative researchers discussing their own role or position in a research study, which is normally known as being the researcher being reflexive. We already mentioned in our previous class that reflexive nature of the researchers is an important criterion for qualitative research. Therefore, reflexivity means that the researchers reflect on their own biases, values, and assumptions and actively write them into their research. This reflexivity may also involve discussing personal experiences and identifying how researchers collaborated with participants during the different phases of their qualitative studies. Now the final step. During the eighth step or final step of any educational research, researchers normally disseminate and evaluate their research. The entire research process culminates here, where disseminations of those research reports to audiences who may benefit from the researches are done. Different audiences also evaluate the research process as described within the research report. Quantitative researchers typically report their research studies without referring to themselves or their personal reactions. That means quantitative researchers are more objective and unbiased in their dissemination, in their entire reporting of their research studies. The overall format for a report of a quantitative study follows a predictable pattern. There are basically introduction, review of literature, methods, results, and conclusions part in a quantitative research report. When audiences evaluate a quantitative research, there are some basic standards that are applied to all forms of research. For example, audiences judge whether the researchers used ethical procedures when conducting the study. By using ethical procedures, researchers treat participants with respect, such as by obtaining their consent or assent, as we have already discussed in our previous class while we were learning about the research ethics. Audiences also judge whether the prepared article fully and honestly reports complete information about what was done in the study, so that they can make their own assessment about the quality of the study. Further, researchers examine a quantitative study to see whether it has an extensive literature review, tested good research questions and hypotheses, used rigorous impartial data collection procedures, applied appropriate statistical procedures, etc. But qualitative researchers employ a wide range of formats to report their qualitative studies. Although the overall general form follows the standard steps in the process of research, the sequence of these parts of research tends to vary from one qualitative report to another. A study may begin with a long personal narrative told in story form, or with a more objective scientific report that resembles the format found in most quantitative research. Like quantitative research, audiences judge qualitative research to ensure that the researchers used ethical procedures and fully and honestly reported the details of the study. So, the research ethics are same for these two educational research paradigms. That means qualitative research and quantitative research. In addition, good qualitative reports need to be realistic and persuasive in order to convince the reader that the study is an accurate and credible account of individuals' experiences and perspectives. Qualitative reports typically contain extensive data collection to convey the complexity of the phenomenon or process under study. The data analysis procedures incorporate the development of description and themes as well as the interrelation of themes in order to fully capture the complexity of the phenomenon under study in a qualitative research. So, in the due course, I am going to share with you the study that I have mentioned in the very beginning of today's class. How myself and one of my M.Ed students have conducted an M.Ed dissertation using